I have the witness, Taewoo. Your choice is simple. Bring my son home tonight, or the police get this recording in the morning.
You think you can threaten me?
The will reading had already started, and Nadia was only there to refill the water glasses. The remainder of the estate, the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses, passes in full to the sole living heir of Choi Min-jun, his son, currently residing under the guardianship of Nadia Bassey. The room went silent enough to hear the ice melting in the untouched drinks. For 8 years, Nadia had cleaned this house, cooked in this kitchen, and answered to people who never once asked her name properly. She had learned to disappear in plain sight, to become part of the furniture in a home built on secrets far larger than her own. What she never expected was for her secret to be the one that brought the room down. If you're watching this, tell me where you're tuning in from and how the weather's treating you today. Stories like this one deserve to be shared with someone who understands what it means to be underestimated your whole life, only to prove everyone wrong in a single moment. Settle in, because this one is going to stay with you long after it ends. Her name was Nadia Bassey, and this is the story of how a woman the world saw only as a maid became the mother of an empire's last true heir, and made the people who dismissed her answer for every year they spent trying to erase her. But to understand how she ended up standing in that room, you have to go back to who she was before any of it happened. At 24, Nadia had come to Seoul with a work visa, 2 suitcases, and the kind of hope that hadn't yet been tested by anything real. She believed that hard work was noticed eventually. She believed that if you stayed honest and kept your head down, people would see your worth. She believed, most of all, in love that didn't ask permission from anyone's family tree. She met Choi Min-jun before she understood who he was. He didn't introduce himself as the heir to anything. He sat next to her at a small noodle shop near the language school she attended in the evenings, ordered the same thing she did, and made a joke about the owner's dog that made her laugh for the first time in weeks. He kept showing up after that. Not with money, not with promises, just with time to walk her home, time to ask about her family back home, time to listen the way people rarely did. It took months before she learned his last name was Choi, and longer still before she understood what that name meant in certain circles of the city. By then, it didn't matter to her. She wasn't in love with a surname. She was in love with a man who remembered how she took her coffee and who never once made her feel small for where she came from. They married quietly, in a small ceremony with no family present on either side, because both of them understood what his father would do if he found out before it was already done. Min-jun promised her it would only be temporary, that he would find the right time, the right moment, to bring her into the family properly. He kept saying it would be soon. Soon never came. 11 months after their son was born, Min-jun was found dead at the bottom of a stairwell in one of the family's warehouses. The official report called it an accident. Nadia was never allowed to attend the funeral as anything other than household staff, standing at the back of a crowd of mourners who had no idea the small boy she held on her hip was the only piece of Min-jun still breathing. She had a choice then. She could have taken her son and disappeared, started over somewhere the Choi name meant nothing. Instead, she applied for a position in the very house that had buried her husband without ever knowing his wife existed. She told herself it was to keep her son close to the only family blood he had left. Some nights, she told herself it was so she could keep watching the people who might have taken his father from him. Either way, she stayed. She scrubbed their floors and cooked their meals and lowered her eyes when they spoke to her, and she waited, because she had learned that in a house like this, patience was the only weapon a woman like her was ever going to be handed. She never once imagined the old man had known all along. That will reading wasn't supposed to reveal anything. It was supposed to confirm what everyone already assumed, that Taewoo, the nephew who had spent a decade positioning himself as the second son Hyun never had, would inherit everything. Instead, the lawyer kept reading, and every sentence pulled the floor further out from under the room. And Nadia, standing near the door with a water pitcher still in her hand, realized that the life she had built to protect her son in silence was about to become the loudest thing that family had ever heard. The lawyer's voice hadn't changed pace, but the air in the room had. Ti-woo was the first to move, pushing back his chair with enough force that it scraped against the marble floor. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice controlled in the way that told Nadia he was already calculating rather than reacting. "My uncle would never leave this family's future to a stranger's child." "Not a stranger's child," the lawyer said, unmoved. "Mr. Choi Min-jun's son, documented, verified, and acknowledged by Chairman Choi D-hyun himself 3 years before his passing." Every head in the room turned toward Nadia at once. She kept her eyes on the pitcher in her hands, the way she had trained herself to do for 8 years whenever attention landed on her by accident. Except this wasn't an accident anymore, and there was nowhere left to disappear to. To understand how thoroughly she had been underestimated, you have to understand how the Choi household actually worked, beneath the surface politeness that visitors saw. Chairman Choi D-hyun ran his empire the way he ran his home, through information. He rarely raised his voice, rarely repeated himself, and rarely forgave a mistake twice. When Nadia had first applied for the housekeeping position 8 years ago, she assumed she'd been hired because she was cheap, foreign, and unlikely to ask questions about the business conducted behind closed doors. It took her nearly 2 years to understand that D-hyun had never missed anything that happened under his roof. She learned this slowly, through small moments that meant nothing on their own. The way he sometimes called her son by a nickname that only Min-jun had used. The way he once left an envelope of money on the kitchen counter on the boy's birthday, with no note, no explanation, gone by the time she came back to ask about it. The way his eyes lingered on the child during the rare moments they crossed paths in the hallway, longer than a stranger's eyes should linger on someone else's staff. She told herself it was guilt, or curiosity, or nothing at all. She never let herself believe it was recognition, because recognition would have meant he'd known the truth the entire time and chosen silence anyway. That kind of knowledge felt too heavy to carry alongside everything else. Meanwhile, Ti-woo had spent those same 8 years building himself into the son D-hyun no longer had. He attended every meeting, managed every difficult negotiation, absorbed every lesson the old man was willing to teach. He was thorough, patient, and convincing in a way that made people forget to ask what he actually wanted underneath the loyalty. Nadia had watched him operate for years without ever being seen by him as anything more than the woman who ironed his shirts. That was how she learned the most. People speak freely in front of someone they've already decided doesn't matter. She heard Ti-woo on the phone more than once, his voice dropping into a register reserved for conversations that weren't meant for the family ledger. She heard him negotiating shipments that had nothing to do with the legitimate businesses the Choi name used as its public face. She heard him mention Min-jun's name exactly once, on a night she still remembered clearly, saying to whoever was on the other end of the line that the old man's golden son isn't a problem anymore, and he won't be missed the way people think. She had gone still in the hallway that night, the tray in her hand suddenly too heavy to hold steady. She told herself she'd misheard the context. She told herself grief made people say things about the dead that sounded worse than they meant. She kept working, kept serving tea, kept raising her son under a roof that might have held the answer to how his father actually died. It was D-hyun who first tested her, though she didn't understand it as a test until much later. 6 months before his death, he'd asked her without warning to bring the boy to his study instead of sending him to bed. He studied the child's face for a long time in silence, then asked Nadia plainly, "Does he know his father's name?" She'd nearly dropped the tray then. She managed to say only that the boy knew his father had passed away before he was born. D-hyun nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself rather than learning it for the first time, and told her she could go. Neither of them spoke of it again. Now, standing in a room full of people who had spent years looking past her, Nadia finally understood what that conversation had actually been. It hadn't been curiosity. It had been the old man quietly building a case, gathering the confirmation he needed to make sure that, when he was gone, the truth would outlive his silence. He had protected her secret for years, not because he owed her anything, but because some part of him needed his son's bloodline to survive the family he was leaving behind, even if that bloodline came through a woman he'd never publicly acknowledge while he was alive. Tiwoo's eyes moved from the lawyer to Nadia, calculating something new. "You've known," he said quietly, not a question. "This whole time you've known exactly what you were." Nadia finally looked up and met his eyes for the first time in 8 years, without lowering her gaze first. "I knew who I married," she said. "I never once claimed to be anything more than his wife." The room absorbed that sentence the way a struck bell absorbs silence afterward, the sound still moving through the walls long after it should have stopped. Tiwoo's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd started working in that house, Nadia watched him look at her the way a man looks at a threat he failed to see coming. The next morning arrived quietly, which surprised her. She had expected sirens, lawyers, chaos. Instead, the house observed its usual silence, as if nothing had happened at all, as if a woman hadn't been unmasked in front of an entire family the night before. Nadia woke before dawn, the way she always did, and lay still for a moment listening to her son breathe in the small room they shared at the end of the staff corridor. He was 7 now, old enough to sense when something in the house had shifted, too young to understand what any of it meant. He'd asked her only one question the night before, after she tucked him in. "Why did everyone look at you like that?" She told him it was nothing, that grown-ups sometimes looked at people strangely when they were surprised. He'd accepted the answer the way children do, trusting that his mother would tell him the truth eventually, in whatever order she decided was right. She dressed for her usual morning duties out of habit more than necessity. She wasn't sure yet whether she was still expected to serve breakfast to a family that now knew exactly who she was. But routine felt safer than uncertainty, so she made her way to the kitchen the way she had for 8 years. She found the head housekeeper already there, a woman named Mrs. Beek who had trained Nadia on her first week in the house and had never once in 8 years asked her a single personal question. Mrs. Beek looked at her now with an expression Nadia couldn't quite place, not hostility, not warmth, something closer to reassessment. "The family will take breakfast in the private dining room this morning," Mrs. Beek said. "Not you. You've been asked to wait in the east sitting room instead." "Asked by whom?" "The lawyer and Madame Choi Jaisu." Nadia hadn't expected that name. Jaisu was Di Hyun's younger sister, a woman in her 60s who had lived in the family's second residence outside the city for as long as Nadia had worked there, rarely making appearances at the main house except for holidays and funerals. She was, by every account Nadia had gathered over the years, the only member of the family Tiwoo had never managed to fully win over. The east sitting room was smaller than the rooms used for entertaining guests, decorated plainly, the kind of room reserved for conversations the family didn't want overheard by staff. Nadia found the irony almost unbearable, being asked to wait in a room built for privacy from people like her. Jaisu was already seated when Nadia arrived, a cup of tea untouched in front of her. She studied Nadia for a long moment before speaking. "Sit," she said. "You've stood in this house long enough." Nadia sat carefully, unsure what kind of conversation this was going to be. "My brother was many things," Jaisu said. "Cruel when the business demanded it, cold more often than not. But he was never careless, and he never did anything without calculating every version of how it could end." She took a sip of her tea. "He told me 2 years ago that he'd found something. He didn't tell me what. He only said that when the time came, I should make sure his nephew's plans didn't move faster than the courts could." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Tiwoo has already begun moving faster than the courts. Jaisu said. He filed an emergency petition this morning, requesting temporary guardianship of your son be transferred to the family's board of directors, on the grounds that a single mother with no legal standing in this country presents, in his words, an unstable environment for a child of this inheritance's significance. The words landed harder than Nadia expected. She'd known Ti-Woo would fight. She hadn't expected him to move against her son specifically, this quickly, using the language of concern to disguise what was, underneath it, an attempt to take the boy from her entirely. Can he do that? He can try, Jaisu said. Whether a Korean court grants it depends on how the petition is framed and how quickly you respond. He's counting on you not knowing the system well enough to fight back in time. She finally met Nadia's eyes directly. He's underestimating you the same way everyone in this house has for 8 years. I'd suggest you stop allowing that to be a safe assumption for him. Nadia thought of the folder still hidden beneath the loose floorboard in her room, the transaction records, the warehouse logs, the name that connected Ti-Woo to the week her husband died. She had planned to move carefully, to build her case slowly the way she'd built everything else in this house, patiently, invisibly, until the moment was right. Ti-Woo's petition had just removed patience as an option. I need a lawyer of my own, Nadia said, not the family's. I've already arranged one, Jaisu said, sliding a card across the table. Discreet and not beholden to anyone with the Choi name attached to their retainer. You'll meet with her this afternoon. She paused. Understand something before you go further into this. If you fight him and win, you don't just secure your son's inheritance. You take everything Ti-Woo has spent a decade building toward. He will not forgive that, and he will not stop finding ways to come after you and your son, formally or otherwise. And if I don't fight? Jaisu's expression didn't soften. Then he takes your son from you legally, raises him inside an organization that killed his father, and you spend the rest of your life on the outside of the only family your child has left. There is no version of this where you get to remain invisible again. Nadia looked down at the card in her hand, then out the window toward the driveway where, for the second morning in a row, she could see a car she didn't recognize parked just past the gate, its driver watching the house with the patience of someone who had been told to wait for instructions. She understood, finally, that the choice she'd made 8 years ago, to stay close, to stay hidden, to wait, had brought her exactly to this moment. There was no more room left to wait in. She picked up the card, and for the first time since she'd walked into this house as a stranger with 2 suitcases and no name that mattered to anyone, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear. She felt ready. The lawyer Jaisu had arranged was named Han Soo-jin, a woman in her 40s who ran a small practice out of a modest office 2 districts away from anything connected to the Choi name. She listened to Nadia's account without interrupting, took notes without reacting, and only spoke once Nadia had finished laying out everything. The will, the petition, the folder hidden beneath her floorboard. The petition is aggressive, but it's not unbeatable, Soo-jin said finally. Korean family courts favor biological parents in custody matters, especially when there's no documented history of neglect or instability. Ti-Woo knows this, which means he's not actually trying to win the petition outright. Then what is he trying to do? Delay, Soo-jin said. Every week this stays in courts is a week the estate remains in limbo, which gives him time to move assets, restructure shipments, quietly transfer whatever he doesn't want scrutinized once your son's guardianship, and by extension, financial oversight is formalized. She tapped her pen against the folder. This document you have. The warehouse logs, have you shown this to anyone else? No, only you and the family's lawyer know it exists. Good, keep it that way for now. If Ti-Woo learns you have evidence connecting him to Min-jun's death, he won't fight you in court. He'll stop the fight from happening at all. Soo-jin's tone was matter-of-fact, but Nadia understood the weight underneath it. Over the following 2 weeks, the pressure built from directions Nadia hadn't anticipated. The first came from the household staff itself. Mrs. Beek, who had trained her, who had worked in that house for over 20 years, began finding reasons to avoid being alone with her. Small kindnesses that had existed between them for years, an extra portion at dinner, a warning about which family member was in a foul mood, stopped without explanation. Nadia understood eventually that someone had made it clear to the staff that continued association with her carried risk. The second came through her son's school. A letter arrived stating that the family board, now technically her son's legal financial guardians pending the court's decision, had reviewed his enrollment and recommended a transfer to an international boarding institution better suited to a child of his standing. Nadia recognized the maneuver immediately. It was an attempt to physically separate her son from her under the guise of opportunity, using the very inheritance meant to protect him as the mechanism to take him. She refused in writing through Soo Jin. The board did not push further, not yet, but the attempt told her everything she needed to know about how this fight would be waged. Not through force, through paperwork, through institutions, through decisions made to look reasonable on the surface while gutting her out of her son's life underneath. The third pressure came directly. Ti-woo requested a meeting, alone, in the same study where Di-hyun had once asked her if her son knew his father's name. Nadia went, against Soo-jin's advice, because she understood that refusing would tell him she was afraid, and she had decided she was done confirming that assumption for anyone in this house. He had aged in the weeks since the will reading, or perhaps she was only now allowing herself to notice it. The confidence he wore like a second skin around the rest of the family had thinned slightly when it was just the two of them. "I'm not your enemy," he said without preamble. "I know that's difficult to believe right now. You tried to take my son. I tried to protect the family's interests," he said. "There's a difference, even if you don't see it that way." He moved to the window, his back to her. "You have no idea what it took to build the trust my uncle placed in me. A decade of proving myself in a family that never fully accepted an outsider's blood, even when that outsider gave everything to earn a place in it." "You're an outsider too, then," Nadia said quietly. "That should have taught you something instead of teaching you to protect this family from anyone else who wasn't born into it." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "You think you understand what you've stumbled into," he said. "You don't. This isn't just an inheritance. It's a structure that keeps a lot of dangerous people calm because they trust who holds it. Your son inheriting this destabilizes agreements that took years to build. People far more dangerous than me will have opinions about a child controlling assets this significant." "Is that a warning or a confession?" He turned to face her fully then. "It's the truth, whether you choose to hear it as either." He paused. "Withdraw your objection to the guardianship petition. Let the board manage the estate until he's of age. You keep your son close, keep your position in this house, keep everything exactly as comfortable as it's been for 8 years. Fight this, and I promise you, comfortable is not a word that will describe your life again." Nadia held his gaze, thinking of the folder hidden in her room, thinking of the phone call she'd overheard years ago, thinking of a stairwell and an accident that had never once felt like an accident to her, no matter how many times she tried to convince herself otherwise for her own peace of mind. "You said this isn't just an inheritance," she said. "You're right. It's the only thing my son has left of his father. I've spent 8 years learning exactly how far people in this family are willing to go to protect what they've built." She stood, smoothing her skirt, refusing to let her hands shake. "I think it's time I showed you I learned those lessons as well as anyone born into this name." She left him standing at the window, and for the first time in 8 years, she didn't look back to see how he was watching her go. The retaliation came 3 days later, and it arrived through the one channel Nadia hadn't prepared herself to defend. A tabloid website with loose ties to the family's business rivals published a story with a headline designed to be repeated more than read carefully. It called her a fortune hunter, cited unnamed sources close to the Choi family, who claimed her marriage to Minjun had been arranged for money before his death, and questioned whether the paternity documents commissioned by D. Hyun had been falsified through bribery. None of it was true, but Soo-jin explained the mechanism plainly when Nadia called her in a panic that morning. It doesn't need to be true. It needs to create enough public doubt that, when this reaches the courts, the judge feels political pressure to appear cautious rather than favor an unknown foreign woman over an established, respected board of directors. He did this, Nadia said, T-Woo. Almost certainly, and smart enough to do it through channels that can't be traced directly back to him. Soo-jin's voice hardened. This changes our approach. We can't wait for the custody hearing to use what you have. If he's willing to attack your character publicly, he's preparing the narrative before he moves against you more directly. Nadia sat with that for a long moment, her son's school bag still by the door where he'd left it that morning, unaware that his mother's name was being dragged through headlines across the city, while he sat in a classroom believing the hardest part of his week was a spelling test. What do you suggest? We go to Madame Jai-soo, Soo-jin said, and we ask her to do something she's avoided doing for years, take a public position. Jai-soo agreed to meet them that evening, though her expression when she arrived told Nadia she already understood what was being asked of her. You want me to publicly support your claim, Jai-soo said, once Soo-jin had laid out the situation. Understand what that costs. The moment I stand with you against T-Woo, I've chosen a side in a war I've spent years staying out of specifically because staying out of it kept me alive. I understand, Nadia said. I wouldn't ask if there were another way. Jai-soo studied her for a long moment. My brother left you that folder because he trusted you'd know when to use it. Do you understand what you're holding? Warehouse logs and shipment authorizations are one thing. They suggest a connection. They don't prove murder in a court of law, not on their own. Then what proves it? A witness, Jai-soo said. Someone who was actually there that night, willing to speak and still alive to do it. The silence that followed carried a weight Nadia hadn't anticipated. You know someone. I know of someone, Jai-soo said carefully. A security guard who worked the warehouse the night Minjun died. He was quietly paid a significant severance and relocated to Busan within a week of the incident. I've had someone monitoring his situation for years, in case a day like this ever came. She hesitated. He hasn't spoken because speaking has always meant risking everything he built with that payout. Money doesn't just buy silence. It buys comfort people are reluctant to lose. Then what would make him willing now? Knowing that the person asking has more leverage than the people who paid him to stay quiet, Jai-soo said, and knowing that leverage is aimed specifically at the person he's most afraid of. Nadia understood what she was being told. The folder alone was a suggestion. A living witness, corroborated by the transaction records, was a case. But convincing a man who had spent 8 years buying his silence with fear to suddenly abandon that fear required something stronger than an appeal to conscience. I need to meet him, Nadia said. That's dangerous if T-Woo learns you're looking for him. He already tried to take my son and destroy my name in the same week, Nadia said. I don't think there's a version of this where staying cautious protects either of us anymore. Jai-soo held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself the way her brother once had in that same house, watching a child's face across a quiet study. I'll arrange it, she said, but you'll go alone and you'll go carefully. Whatever he tells you, you'll need more than his word by the time this reaches a courtroom. You'll need him willing to say it under oath, in front of the same family that spent 8 years making sure people like him never speak at all. Nadia thought of the stairwell she'd never seen, the accident report she'd never fully believed, and the 8 years she'd spent serving tea to a family that might have known exactly what happened to her husband the whole time. Then I'll make sure he's willing, she said. The address Jai-soo provided led to a quiet apartment complex in Busan, 3 hours from Seoul by train. in a neighborhood far removed from anything connected to the Choi name. Nadia made the trip alone, exactly as she'd been told, carrying nothing that could be traced back to the family beyond a phone Soo-jin had given her specifically for this purpose. The man who answered the door was older than she expected, perhaps 60, with the kind of tired watchfulness she recognized from years of reading rooms full of people who didn't want to be read. His name was Park Jung-ho, and he didn't invite her in right away. "Jisoo said you'd come eventually," he said. "I told her years ago I hoped you never would." "Then you know why I'm here." "I know exactly why you're here." He stepped back finally, allowing her into a small living room sparsely furnished, the kind of space that looked like it belonged to someone who had never fully let himself settle anywhere. "Sit. I'll make tea, and then I'll tell you why I'm not going to help you, and you can decide whether you believe my reasons." He didn't speak again until the tea was poured, both cups untouched between them. "I was working the warehouse floor that night," he said finally. Min-jun came in around 11 alone, which wasn't unusual. He often reviewed shipment logs after hours, away from people who might report back to his father about what he was looking into. He paused. He'd found something in the records. I don't know exactly what, but I remember him telling me that week that some of the numbers weren't matching what should have been there. Nadia kept her hands still around her cup, though everything in her wanted to lean forward. "What happened that night?" Taewoo arrived around midnight. That wasn't unusual either, not back then. He and Min-jun still worked closely, or seemed to. Jung-ho's voice thinned slightly. "I heard raised voices from the stairwell landing where I was stationed. Not words clearly, just tone. Then it went quiet, and a few minutes later, Taewoo left through the side entrance, alone, walking fast in a way I'd never seen him walk before." "And Min-jun?" "I found him at the bottom of the stairwell 20 minutes later when I did my rounds." Jung-ho's eyes stayed fixed on the untouched tea. "The official report said he lost his footing. I've told myself that story for 8 years because it was easier to live with than the alternative." "But you don't believe it." "I believe a man doesn't fall down a set of stairs he's walked 100 times, 20 minutes after an argument with someone who left in that much of a hurry." Jung-ho finally looked up at her. "I was offered a severance package the next morning, more money than I'd have made in 5 years at that warehouse, along with a strong suggestion that relocating somewhere quieter would be good for my health. I took it. I've spent 8 years telling myself I made the responsible choice, protecting my family instead of chasing a truth that wouldn't have brought Min-jun back regardless." "I understand that choice," Nadia said quietly. "I made a version of it myself, staying silent in that house for 8 years instead of confronting what I suspected." "Then you understand why I won't testify," Jung-ho said. "I have a daughter now, a life here that has nothing to do with Seoul or the Choi name. Speaking up doesn't just risk my comfort, it risks whatever's left of my safety and hers." Nadia set her cup down carefully. "Taewoo tried to take my son from me 2 weeks ago, legally, through a guardianship petition designed to look reasonable to a court while stripping me of any say in his life. When that didn't work fast enough, he had a story planted questioning my character in front of the entire public, hoping it would poison a judge's opinion before we ever reach a hearing." She held Jung-ho's gaze. "He is not a man who stops escalating once he starts. You relocated because staying quiet felt safer than speaking up. I'd ask you to consider what happens to your daughter's safety in a world where he successfully takes control of an empire this size, uncontested, because the one witness who could have stopped him decided silence was easier." Jung-ho was quiet for a long time, his hands wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold. "He'll come after me," he said finally, "the moment he learns I've spoken." "He'll come after both of us regardless," Nadia said. "The only difference is whether we face that outcome having already told the truth, or having stayed silent long enough that it no longer mattered whether we ever did." Jung-ho studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. "Jisoo said you were a housekeeper," he said slowly. She didn't tell me you argued like someone who'd spent her whole life being underestimated by people who assumed silence meant surrender. I spent 8 years learning the difference between the two, Nadia said. I'm done confusing them. He exhaled slowly, the sound of a man setting down a weight he'd carried far longer than he should have. I'll need protection, he said. Real protection, not promises. And I'll need to speak to your lawyer before I agree to anything formal. You'll have both, Nadia said, already reaching for the phone Soo-jin had given her. I promise you that. For the first time since she'd sat down, Young-ho picked up his tea and drank it, as if finally allowing himself to believe that the years of silence he'd been carrying might soon have somewhere honest to go. Soo-jin arranged the formal deposition for the following week, in a secure location outside the city, away from anywhere connected to the Choi name. Young-ho agreed to have his statement recorded and sealed, corroborated against the warehouse logs Di-hyun had left behind. For the first time since the will reading, Nadia allowed herself to believe the ground beneath her had steadied. It lasted 4 days. The call came from her son's school on a Tuesday afternoon, the administrator's voice carrying a controlled panic that told Nadia something was wrong before a single detail was explained. Her son hadn't been picked up at his scheduled time. A car had arrived instead, driven by someone claiming authorization from the family board, presenting documents that appeared legitimate enough that the front office had released him before anyone thought to call and confirm. Nadia's hands went cold around the phone. Where is he now? We don't know. The car left before we realized the paperwork hadn't come from you directly. She called Soo-jin before she'd even hung up with the school, her voice barely holding steady enough to form full sentences. Soo-jin's response was immediate. This is exactly what I warned you he might do. Not force. Paperwork again disguised as authority. Go to the family estate. If he's moved him anywhere, it'll be somewhere he can control the narrative around, not somewhere that looks like a kidnapping. Nadia arrived at the Choi estate faster than she'd ever driven anywhere in her life, walking through the front doors without waiting to be received, past staff who stepped aside without meeting her eyes. She found Ti-woo in the same study where he'd once warned her that comfortable wouldn't describe her life if she fought him. Where is my son? Ti-woo didn't look up immediately from the documents on his desk. He's safe. The board determined, given the ongoing custody dispute and the recent public concerns raised about your character, that a temporary, board-supervised environment was the responsible choice until the courts resolve guardianship. You had him removed from school without my knowledge or consent. The paperwork was filed properly, Ti-woo said, finally meeting her eyes. Board authorization pending court review. Nothing about this was illegal, Nadia. Uncomfortable, perhaps. Necessary in my judgment. This is kidnapping wearing a suit. This is protection, he said, his voice even. The same protection I offered you weeks ago, which you refused. I told you there would be consequences to fighting this. I didn't enjoy having to demonstrate what those consequences look like, but you left me limited options. Nadia felt something in her chest that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 8 years of careful invisibility. Not fear, not this time, but a rage so complete it steadied rather than shook her. You said Min-jun's death destabilized agreements that took years to build, she said quietly. I know what happened to him. I have a witness, Ti-woo. Someone who was in that warehouse the night you argued with him, 20 minutes before he was found at the bottom of that stairwell. For the first time since she'd known him, Ti-woo's composure cracked, just slightly, just long enough for her to see it. You're bluffing. I'm not, she said. And unlike you, I don't need paperwork dressed up as protection to prove what I'm holding. I have a sworn statement, corroborated against shipment logs your uncle kept for exactly this reason. He knew Ti-woo. He knew for years, and he built a case instead of confronting you directly, because he understood exactly what you were capable of when cornered. The silence between them stretched long enough that Nadia could hear the estate's clock ticking somewhere down the hall. "Bring my son back to me tonight," she said. Or that statement, along with everything connecting you to that warehouse, goes to the prosecutor's office in the morning, alongside the tabloid retraction, proving you planted that story about my character. "You'd be signing up for a war you don't understand the shape of," Tiwoo said quietly. "There are people connected to this family's business who will not accept public scrutiny of that night. Exposing me doesn't just end my career, Nadia. It opens doors neither of us can close again. I've spent 8 years living quietly in a house I now understand you may have wanted me too afraid to challenge," Nadia said. "You miscalculated. Fear was never the reason I stayed silent. My son was. And you just proved to me exactly how far you're willing to go to take him from me, which means silence stopped protecting either of us the moment you had him pulled out of that school." Tiwoo studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that looked, for the first time, like genuine uncertainty rather than calculation. "He's at the countryside residence," he said finally. "Unharmed. I'll have him brought back tonight. And you'll withdraw the guardianship petition." "That's not a decision I can make alone anymore," Tiwoo said. "But I'd suggest, before you decide how loudly you intend to use what you're holding, that you consider whether the empire you're fighting me for is one you actually want to inherit the full weight of. Some truths don't stay contained once you release them, even against the person you meant to punish with them." Nadia held his gaze without flinching, thinking of her son somewhere in a countryside house he didn't understand the reason for, thinking of a witness in Busan who had finally chosen truth over safety, thinking of a folder an old man had left behind because he trusted her to know when patience had run its course. "Bring him home," she said. "Everything else we'll decide in a courtroom, in front of everyone this family has spent years teaching to look away." Her son was returned that night, brought by a driver who said nothing beyond confirming the boy hadn't been harmed. He was tired and confused rather than frightened, having been told only that he was staying somewhere new for a few days as part of family arrangements. He didn't understand. Nadia held him longer than she meant to once the door closed behind them, long enough that he eventually pulled back and asked if she was crying because something bad had happened. She told him no. She told him she'd simply missed him more than she expected to in one afternoon. It was, in its own way, the truth. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the small kitchen table in her room, the folder from Daehyun spread beside Young-ho's sealed statement, and made a decision she'd been circling for weeks without letting herself land on it fully. Tiwoo's warning had stayed with her, that some truths didn't stay contained once released, even against the person she meant to punish with them. She understood what he meant now. If she exposed the warehouse logs formally, connecting him to Min-jun's death, it wouldn't just end his claim to the inheritance. It would expose the shipment activity itself, and whatever illegal business had been moving through that warehouse the night her husband died. She called Soo-jin at 6 the next morning. "I need to understand exactly what those shipment logs are documenting," Nadia said. "Not just that Tiwoo was there, what he was moving." Soo-jin was quiet for a moment. "I had a financial analyst review the numbers last week, cross-referenced against public shipping records for that period. The volume documented in those logs doesn't match anything the Choi family's legitimate businesses would have needed that month." She paused. "It matches patterns typically associated with unregistered pharmaceutical distribution. Not something the family's known criminal reputation usually touches. This looked more specific, more contained, like a side operation Tiwoo was running without full family authorization. Meaning Daehyun didn't know about this specific arrangement. Meaning Min-jun likely found evidence of an operation his cousin was running behind the family's back, using Choi resources without permission," Soo-jin said. "If that's what got him killed, this isn't just a custody dispute or an inheritance fight anymore. This is evidence of an unauthorized criminal enterprise that could bring serious legal consequences down on Tiwoo independent of anything related to your son." Nadia sat with that information for a long moment, understanding the full shape of what she was now holding. Not just a witness to an argument, not just a suspicious death. A motive, finally, one solid enough that a prosecutor wouldn't need to rely solely on circumstantial timing to build a case. Tiwoo warned me that exposing him opens doors we can't close again, she said. He meant this. Whoever he was working with on that operation won't want this exposed either. Which means the moment this becomes public, you're not just fighting one man for an inheritance, Soo-jin said carefully. You're potentially exposing yourself to whoever he was answering to on that shipment. I need you to understand that risk clearly before we decide how to proceed. Nadia thought of 8 years spent making herself small enough to survive in that house. 8 years of swallowing suspicion and grief, because speaking up had never once felt like it belonged to someone in her position. She thought of her son, brought home the night before by a driver who offered no apology, taken from a schoolyard because paperwork made it look permissible. I've spent 8 years being careful, she said. Careful kept me alive. It didn't protect my husband, and it almost didn't protect my son yesterday. I'm done deciding my next move based on what keeps me safest. I want to know what keeps my son's future safest, permanently, not just through this custody fight. Then we don't leak this quietly through the courts, Soo-jin said slowly, an idea forming in her voice. Tiwoo built his position in that family through control of information, deciding what the family knew, what the public knew, what even Di-hyun was allowed to see. If we hand this to a courtroom privately, he negotiates delays, buries it in appeals for years while your son grows up in legal limbo. Then what do you suggest? The family holds a memorial gathering next week, Soo-jin said. Formal, public, attended by every branch of the family, and enough of the broader business community that reputation matters more in that room than in any courtroom. Jisoo mentioned it's traditionally when significant family announcements are made, including, historically, resolutions to inheritance disputes. She paused. If Tiwoo built his power through controlled information, the only way to beat him completely is to remove his ability to control it at all. Publicly, in front of the people whose respect he spent a decade building his position on. Nadia felt something settle in her chest, cold and clear. The same stillness she imagined Tiwoo felt right before he made a decision he'd already convinced himself was necessary. Arrange it, she said. I want Young-ho's statement ready, the shipment logs prepared, and Jisoo informed of exactly what's about to happen in her family's house. You understand once this starts, there's no controlling how far it goes. I've spent 8 years controlling myself, so this family never had to face what they'd built, Nadia said. It's time they understood exactly what they created, in front of everyone who ever looked at me and saw nothing worth watching. The memorial hall filled slowly over the course of that morning. Exactly as Soo-jin had predicted. Extended family Nadia had only ever seen from the edges of rooms. Business partners who addressed the Choi name with the particular respect reserved for people whose displeasure carried consequences, and staff moving quietly through the space, setting up chairs and flowers for a ceremony honoring a man whose final act had been arming the one person in his house nobody thought to fear. Nadia sat near the back with her son beside her, dressed simply, the way she always dressed, though every eye in the room found her eventually regardless of where she chose to sit. Tiwoo occupied a position near the front, beside Jisoo, playing the role of grieving nephew and rightful successor with the same practiced ease he brought to everything. The ceremony began traditionally enough, remembrances, a formal address from one of the family's senior business associates, the kind of measured grief that comes from people mourning an institution as much as a man. Nadia waited, her hand resting lightly on her son's shoulder, until the moment Soo-jin had identified as the natural opening. It was Jisoo who created it, standing when the formal remembrances concluded, addressing the room in a voice that had clearly commanded attention long before Nadia had ever met her. Before we close this gathering, Jaisu said, there's a matter my brother left unresolved that this family deserves clarity on, particularly given the disputes that have arisen since his passing. Tiwoo's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a man recognizing too late that the ground beneath him had already been rearranged. 8 years ago, Jaisu continued, my nephew Minjun died in a warehouse accident that this family accepted without question, because questioning it felt disloyal to a business built on trust between family members. She paused, letting the words settle. I no longer believe it was an accident, and I no longer believe silence serves this family the way we've told ourselves it does. Nadia stood then exactly as she and Sujin had planned, her son's hand still held in hers, though she gently released it now, asking Mrs. Beek, who had arrived at Jaisu's quiet request to sit with him nearby. My name is Nadia Bassey, she said, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. For 8 years, most of you knew me only as staff in this house. What you didn't know was that I was married to Min Jun before his death, and that the boy sitting behind me is his son, and the rightful heir this family's own will has already confirmed. Murmurs moved through the room, though most present had already heard some version of the will reading's aftermath through whatever channels carried gossip through families like this one. What you don't yet know, she continued, is why Min Jun died the night he did. She nodded to Sujin, who stepped forward with a tablet displaying the sealed documents. 8 years ago, Min Jun discovered discrepancies in warehouse shipment records, records showing an unauthorized pharmaceutical distribution operation being run through this family's resources without Chairman Choi Di-hyun's knowledge or approval. Ti-woo rose slowly from his seat. This is a fabrication designed to discredit a legitimate claim to this family's leadership. A security guard who was on duty that night has provided a sworn, notarized statement, Nadia said, her voice cutting through his without raising volume, confirming that Ti-woo arrived at the warehouse shortly before midnight, engaged in a heated confrontation with Min Jun, and left alone 20 minutes before Min Jun was found dead at the bottom of that stairwell. She turned to face him directly. The shipment logs corroborate the timeline. Financial analysis confirms the distribution pattern doesn't match any of this family's legitimate operations during that period. The room had gone entirely silent now, the kind of silence that carries more weight than any amount of noise could. You're relying on the word of a man who was paid to disappear, Ti-woo said, though the confidence in his voice had thinned considerably. Coerced testimony from someone with obvious financial motivation to say whatever benefits your position. He came forward despite 8 years of being paid specifically to stay silent, Nadia said. Despite understanding exactly what speaking up might cost him, he came forward because he was finally asked by someone willing to risk more than he was. Jaisu stepped forward then, addressing the room rather than Ti-woo directly. My brother suspected this for years. He commissioned the paternity documentation for Nadia's son not out of sentiment, but because he understood he might need an heir this family trusted completely, should evidence of his nephew's other activities ever surface. She looked at Ti-woo now, her expression carrying decades of complicated family history. He protected you from this exposure while he lived, hoping you'd correct course on your own. He left the choice of when to expose it to whoever survived him with something worth protecting. Ti-woo looked around the room, at faces that had spent a decade trusting him with increasing responsibility, now recalculating everything they'd believed about the man they'd been grooming to lead them. Nadia watched something in him finally understand that the room's silence wasn't confusion anymore. It was verdict. Everything I built, he said quietly, everything I did for this family, was built on the death of the man whose son now inherits everything you tried to take, Nadia said. This family taught me for 8 years that silence was the price of survival in this house. You taught me, these past few weeks, that silence was never actually protecting anyone. It was only protecting whoever benefited most from the people around them staying quiet. She turned to the room, to the collected weight of the family and the associates who would decide. Through the currency of reputation this world ran on, exactly how far Tiwoo's fall would extend. The evidence has already been shared with the appropriate authorities this morning, Sujin said, stepping forward to formalize what everyone in the room now understood. This is no longer a private family matter to be managed quietly. Tiwoo stood alone at the front of a room that had, within the space of 10 minutes, stopped seeing him as anything close to what he'd spent a decade convincing them he was. Formal proceedings took another 3 months to fully resolve, though the outcome had been settled the moment the memorial hall emptied that afternoon. Tiwoo was arrested within the week, the prosecutor's office moving quickly once Jung-ho's statement and the financial records reached them, corroborated further by evidence the unauthorized distribution network's own associates provided once they understood the operation had been exposed and had every incentive to distance themselves from what remained of it. He faced charges connecting him to Min Jun's death, along with the unregistered pharmaceutical operation that had run beneath the family's legitimate businesses for years without full authorization. The guardianship petition was withdrawn the same week, the board reorganizing under Jae-soo's temporary oversight until Nadia's son came of age, with Nadia formally recognized as his legal guardian and trustee exactly as Lee Hyun's will had specified from the beginning. The tabloid that had run the story questioning her character issued a quiet retraction, buried deep enough in its publication that few noticed, though by then it no longer mattered. The story that spread through the family's business circles wasn't the one about a housekeeper's fabricated scandal. It was the one about a mother who had spent 8 years surviving in plain sight, patient enough to wait for the exact moment her silence stopped being useful to anyone but the people trying to erase her. Mrs. Beek was the first of the household staff to approach her once the dust settled, an awkwardness in her posture that hadn't been there in years of easy familiarity between them. "I should have looked closer," Mrs. Beek said. 8 years, and I never once wondered why you stayed in a house like this instead of somewhere easier." "You weren't meant to wonder," Nadia said. "That was the point of staying quiet for as long as I did." "What will you do now?" Mrs. Beek asked, "now that everyone knows exactly who you are?" Nadia considered the question for a long moment, looking out toward the garden where her son now played without the careful watchfulness he'd learned to carry during those weeks of upheaval, unaware that the freedom he felt now had been fought for in courtrooms and memorial halls he'd never fully understand the weight of. "I'm going to raise my son the way his father would have wanted," she said. "Somewhere he learns his family's history honestly, instead of learning to survive it quietly the way I did." Jae-soo remained close in the months that followed, taking on a mentorship role with Nadia's son that neither of them had anticipated when the will reading first upended the family's plans. She often said the boy reminded her of Min Jun at that age, before the family's expectations had shaped him into someone more cautious than he'd been born to be. Nadia found something like peace in watching her son build a relationship with the family history that had once nearly cost him everything, guided now by someone who genuinely wanted him to inherit more than just an empire. Jung-ho relocated once more, this time with a level of security and gratitude that made the choice feel less like exile and more like a fresh beginning. He'd finally earned the right to choose for himself. He visited Seoul once briefly to see the outcome of what his testimony had helped set in motion. He told Nadia before he left that he'd spent 8 years believing his silence had been the responsible choice for his family. He said watching her son grow into a life built on truth instead of fear had finally convinced him he'd made the right choice in breaking that silence, however late it came. A year after the will reading, Nadia stood in the same study where Lee Hyun had once studied her son's face in silence, now repurposed as a small office where she reviewed the estate's affairs alongside Soo-jin, who had become as much a friend as a lawyer over the course of the fight. The house felt different now, not because the walls had changed, but because she no longer moved through them, expecting to disappear into the background of someone else's story. Her son found her there one evening, his school bag still on his shoulder, and asked the question she'd been waiting for since the day the truth first became public. "Did you know," he asked, "that grandfather knew about us the whole time?" "I didn't know for certain," she said. "I hoped sometimes. I didn't let myself believe it until the day the will was read." "Why didn't he just tell everyone sooner, before he died?" Nadia considered the question carefully, understanding that the answer mattered more to her son's future than almost anything else she could teach him. "Sometimes people spend so many years protecting something," she said, "they forget that protecting it quietly isn't the same as protecting it completely. Your grandfather learned that lesson too late to fix it himself. He left the rest of it for us to finish." Her son nodded slowly, the way children do when they understand more of an answer than they let on, and went to find his homework, leaving Nadia alone in a study that no longer felt like it belonged to a family history she'd spent 8 years surviving from the edges of. She had spent nearly a decade being underestimated, dismissed, and rendered invisible by people who mistook her silence for weakness instead of patience. In the end, it was that same patience, and the truth she'd carried quietly for so long, that had finally dismantled everything built on the lie of her husband's death. She was no longer the maid nobody noticed. She was Nadia Bassey, mother to the heir of an empire that finally understood exactly what it had underestimated the entire time.